We have finally gotten John chapter 11 to the actual raising of Lazarus. We've been waiting for it and waiting for it and waiting for it, but it's finally here. John chapter 11. Last week we left off in verse 37, talking about Mary, and this week they're going to be out and we're going to see the miracle. What I want you to see this week as we look at this text is it's not just the sign of the death and resurrection of Lazarus and the sign of Jesus, but it's even more than that. What I hope you get out of today is that the death, the resurrection, the ascension of Jesus was always the plan. It was always the plan. This is the sign that is meant to exemplify it. This is why this is the last sign that John gives, the kind of final climactic sign that we've been talking about, John chapter 11. Here's what's happened so far. If you haven't been with us, John chapter 11, at the beginning, there's a couple ladies named Mary and Martha. They write a letter to Jesus and say, our brother Lazarus, the one whom you love, is sick. And most likely, they then send the letter to Jesus, who's on the other side of the Jordan, and he's teaching there. They're in a town called Bethany, which is close to Jerusalem, a little less than 2 miles away. They send word to Jesus on the other side of the Jordan. Most likely, Lazarus dies before word ever gets to Jesus. Nonetheless, Jesus still waits a couple days. Finally, he tells his disciples, Lazarus is dead, let's go back to Judea, to which they oppose, or they call into question this decision to go back to Judea, where most recently the Jews were trying to kill Jesus. Everybody knows at this point that the Jews are looking for him and trying to kill him, but he decides to go back anyways. To go back, he waits 2 days, but then they set out for Judea, and eventually they get there. Last couple weeks, we've been looking at the discussions when Jesus is just outside Bethany. So he heads there from the east of the Jordan, and he waits outside the city of Bethany. Martha comes out to him. He has a conversation with Martha, gives her this profound truth when she comes to him with logic, trying to make sense of what all is going on. And he tells her, I am the resurrection and the life. And he asks her if she believes. And she says, yes, I believe. You're the Son of God. I believe you're the Christ. And then he tells her, go get your sister. And so she goes back into town. She gets Mary. And she says, the teacher is waiting for you. He's wanting to talk with you. And so she comes then out of Bethany, and we see the interaction that Jesus has with her. Now, last week, we talked about a whole lot about the empathy that Jesus shows Mary. And the difference we looked at between the way that he ministers to Martha and the way that he ministers to Mary, and how he just kind of rolls with whatever the person needs who's standing in front of him, and how good at that he is. So as we go into verse 38 here, we're going to hit a word in the Greek that Jesus has it's already been described of him earlier in verse 33. We covered it last week, but I want to expound on the meaning again. So this is John chapter 11, verse 38. We just finished the conversation with Mary, and Jesus and Mary and Martha and the crowd are now approaching the tomb. So verse 38, then Jesus, deeply moved again, came to the tomb. It was a cave, and a stone lay against it. And the word that I want to point out is this word, deeply moved. This past week, after Sunday, somebody from the church came up to me and said, isn't there more going on here than just empathy? Isn't there more going on in Jesus' response of weeping than just empathy? And the reality is that he was right. The person who came up and said, isn't the description that Jesus was deeply moved isn't there more to that than just empathy? Some of your translations, if you're reading a New Living Translation or the Message, it won't say deeply moved. It'll say he was angry. And that throws people a little bit sometimes. Why is the description of Jesus, when these people are coming to him and they're weeping, why is the description angry? Now, some people have tried to say that word that's translated in my version, deeply moved, doesn't mean angry. It just means like a strong sort of emotion. But in reality, I did a little more searching this past week. In reality, you really cannot separate that word. It's a very specific Greek word from an anger at the most, an indignation, an irritation at the very least. It just really cannot be outside of that context. So what I say when I mean I want to broaden the context for you is that I don't think what we talked about last week is wrong. I do think that Jesus is primarily empathizing with Mary. But I also think that because the description that John gives Jesus' response is being deeply moved or in some ways irritated, I do think we need to understand that Jesus is seeing big picture here. He's seeing the people in front of him weeping, but he's also realizing that these people, no matter how many signs he shows them, just simply choose not to believe. He's well aware that he's going to raise Lazarus from the dead, and at this point he seems well aware that even when he raises Lazarus from the dead, still people are not going to believe. They want to kill him. They know that he's doing signs. They're seeing the signs, and yet they simply choose not to believe. So there does seem to be also an indignation with Jesus in this moment. Not only has this guy whom he loved died, but he's also seeing the fact that, first of all, death was never supposed to be. Like, there was not supposed to be this heartache, this tragedy, this pain, this sort of suffering. And all this sort of pain, this sort of suffering came about because of sin. And the same sin that brought about this death of the one whom he loved is the same sin that's causing these people to just harden their hearts and not see the signs and not understand who Jesus is. So I think when the text says that Jesus was deeply moved, it is an empathic response. It is understanding that he loved this man and this man's now dead. But even more than that, it's a broader response to the nature of the people in the story and us. When we live and we see the truth right in front of us and we choose to just reject it. There's an indignation, there's an anger that God experiences when he reveals himself clearly to people and they just simply say, I don't want that. All happening at the same time. So just know that is in the back of Jesus' response here. This is Jesus' words after he comes up to the cave. It's verse 39. Jesus said, take away the stone. And Martha, the sister of the dead man, said to him, Lord, by this time there will be an odor, for he has been dead for 4 days. So here's where we see the significance of Jesus waiting 2 days before he returns to the tomb. We've asked this question a bunch of times, why would Jesus wait 2 days? And up to this point, we've really just given the response that Jesus needed Lazarus to die. But if it's true that Lazarus probably died while the courier was going to Jesus, why did he wait 2 days? Why did he still wait 2 days? And this is really where you get that answer as to why Jesus waited 2 days. In the Jewish culture, Jewish people, they had this understanding that if a body was dead for more than 3 days, it was really dead, never coming back. There may be a misdiagnosis of death if the body's only been dead for a day. Maybe you couldn't tell if the person was really dead. 2 days, okay, maybe they might still come back to life. Maybe they were never really dead. But after 3 days, what they knew was that a body that's starting to decay because it's dead stinks after 3 days. So by the 4th day, for sure, this guy is dead. So I think the reason why Jesus really waited 2 days was that so when he gets to the tomb and he says to roll away the stone, there's no question whether or not he's resurrecting somebody from the dead. There's no like, oh, maybe he wasn't dead. It's only been a day since Lazarus has been in the tomb. No, by this time, it's 4 days. The body stinks. This guy's dead, and he's about to get up out of the grave and walk. Everything that Jesus does is extremely, extremely calculated, even to the point of waiting 2 days to make sure this sign happens the way that it's supposed to. Here's Jesus' response to Martha. Jesus said to her, did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God? This response may be that somewhat of an indignation that we were talking about when Jesus even approaches the tomb. Because even at this point, it seems, even though Jesus' conversation with Martha, he said to her, your brother will rise again. She doesn't seem to understand the complexity of what's going on. And so when she questions Jesus at this point, after already having made the confession in verse 27, I believe you're the Christ, I believe you're the Son of God. Now Jesus is asking her to act on that confession, and she questions him. Like, whoa, I'm not sure that's the best plan. And the reality is we do this all the time. We figure out who God is, we figure out who Jesus is, and we say, he says, do you believe? And we say, yes, I believe. And then he says, okay, now I want you to go over here and do this. And we say, wow, wait a minute, I'm not sure if that's really the best plan. A few weeks ago, I shared a little bit of my story of God calling me to be a Christian studies major at GCU. And that was a struggle for me because I didn't realize that when I had prayed to God and asked him, what should I do with college, what should I do with my life, and he told me to go to GCU, that he would then ask me to be a Christian studies major. I was really just asking to know which school should I go play soccer at. I wasn't really asking what should I do with my life or what direction do you have for me, and I didn't realize he was giving me that answer altogether. And so when he then called me to be a Christian studies major, I was like, nah, that sounds like a dumb plan, and fought it. But even after I gave in, even after I said, okay, God, I'm positive I'm hearing you at this point. It's actually kind of annoying how many times I've heard you. I really don't want to do this, but I will, because it seems like you're pretty set on me doing this. And even after I signed up for classes and started classes, I remember being halfway through the first semester that I signed up for Christian studies classes and sitting in class feeling like this is ridiculous. I remember going back to God and saying, this is a stupid plan. Like, there has got to be someone else. There has got to be someone more qualified. There has got to be someone more holy. There has got to be someone else that you can use, surely, that you could use more than you could use me. So this doesn't really make any sense. And I got a similar response to when Jesus said to Martha, did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God? My response essentially from God was, did I not call you to this? You don't think I can use you. You don't think that you're the best one, but didn't I ask you to do this? So if I asked you to do it, what does it matter whether you're more qualified or less qualified or whatever? It doesn't really matter. It really only matters, did I ask you to do it? To which I kind of sucked it up and said, okay, fine. The question really at this point that he's asking Martha is, how obedient are you willing to be? And I think that we get to this point in our lives too, where God's asking us, how obedient are you willing to be? If he told you that you could be a good mom even though you've maybe not been the greatest mom in the past, when he asks you to do something to be a good mom, are you going to go, nah, I don't think I'm capable of doing that? Or you're going to get the response, didn't I call you to be a good mom? Like, didn't I call you to be a good husband? And in that moment, you're going to have to either stay stuck or do what the people did in the next verse, which is they just were obedient. They just sucked it up and did what he was asking. The question is, how long will you clearly hear from God, this is what I'm supposed to be doing with my life, and wait to do what he's asking you to do? How long will you question his methods? How long will you question the path that he has for you to go? Maybe he's given you a target, but he's taking you on the path over here to get to the target. And you're sitting there going, well, it doesn't make much sense to me. But it doesn't really matter. If he's called you to do it, it's simply what he's asking you to do. So verse 41, there's no audible response to Jesus' question to Mary. The question is pretty obvious, the answer. So there's no audible response from Martha, not Mary, Martha. They just do it. Verse 41. So they took the stone away. And Jesus lifted up his eyes and said, Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I know that you always hear me, but I said this on account of the people standing around, that they may believe that you sent me. So what we have in second half of verse 41 and verse 42 is the very first prayer text in John's gospel. There's 3 of them. Second one is in John chapter 12, a couple verses, and then the huge major one is in John 17, which is what's known as the high priestly prayer, 20-some verses in John 17. But this is the first one. First time that God looks up to heaven, the Son looks up to heaven and speaks to the Father directly. If God were one God and not three in one, verses like this don't make sense. Because God, if he was in heaven and then he came down to earth and there wasn't still the Father in heaven, wouldn't be looking up to God, speaking to no one. It only makes sense if he's looking up to heaven, praying to the Father. So what's the significance of this prayer? Because this is what's going to connect the death and resurrection of Jesus to his ascension. It all comes out in this story if we're paying attention to the details. He says, Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I know that you always hear me, but I said this on account of the people standing around, that they may believe that you sent me. So the prayer takes the form of the prophet Elijah from the Old Testament. I'm going to read to you a couple stories from the prophet Elijah so that you can hear the similar wording that Jesus uses, that Elijah uses. And then we'll ask the question, why does that matter? Why would Jesus, when he's about to raise Lazarus from the dead, pray a prayer to God that puts him in the image of a prophet named Elijah from the Old Testament? Why would he bring that in this moment? First story is from 1 Kings chapter 17. This is the prophet Elijah is told by God to go to the house of a widow. He goes, travel to this city. There's a widow. You need to go there. You need to stay with her. And so Elijah travels to the city and sees this widow, and she's drawing water at the city gate. And he goes to her and he says, can you get me some water? And so the widow draws him some water, and he says, thanks. And then he says, can you go home and can you bake me a cake? Basically a little bread. Can you make me something to eat? And the woman says, I can't. I came here to draw water, and then I was going to go home. I only have a little bit of flour left. I was going to bake my last meal for me and my son, and then we're going to die. And I came here to get the water to make the cake, so I don't have enough. That was the plan. And so Elijah tells her, go home, bake a cake for you and your son, then make a cake for me, and then I'm going to stay with you, and until rain comes, all part of the events that are happening with the guy in power, who's Ahab, the king at that time. Until rain comes, your oil jar and your flour jar will not run out. And so Elijah goes, stays with the woman, eats her cake, and the oil jar and the flour jar don't run out. And well, the whole time while Elijah stays with her. But this story happens in the midst of it. So this is 1 Kings 17. Now it came about after these things that the son of the woman, the mistress of the house, became sick. And his sickness was so severe that there was no breath left in him. He died. So she said to Elijah, What do I have to do with you, O man of God? Have you come to bring my iniquity to remembrance and to put my son to death? So she brings her son to him, and she's like, you came to me. I mean, I've been watching this miracle happen every day. There's flour, there's oil, it never runs out. But my son died. So like, what good are you to come here and keep us from dying of hunger if my son's going to die of sickness? What's the point of that? So, verse 19, he said to her, give me your son. And then he took her from her bosom and carried him up to the upper room where he was living, and he laid him on his own bed. And he called to the Lord and said, O Lord my God, have you also brought calamity to the widow with whom I am staying by causing her son to die? There's a sort of confusion in Elijah. He's like, you called me to stay with this woman, and she's doing this miracle in her midst, and yet you're going to let her son die? That doesn't make any sense. She says, then he stretched out himself upon the child 3 times, and he called out to the Lord and said, listen, O Lord my God, I pray to you, let this child's life return to him. And the Lord heard the voice of Elijah. And the life of the child returned to him, and he revived. And Elijah took the child and brought him down from the upper room into the house and gave him to his mother. And Elijah said, see, your son is alive. And then listen to the woman's response. This is the response that the people of God should have had to the miracle that Jesus was about to perform. The woman said to Elijah, now I know that you are a man of God, and that the word of the Lord in your mouth is true. What we're going to see progress in this story is that the Jews are going to see the sign, understand the sign, and they're still going to try to kill Jesus. So instead of the response being, I know you're from God, you have to be from God, no one else could possibly do this, their response is very, very different as the story goes on. Here's another story from Elijah. This is the one maybe you're more familiar with. This is when Elijah goes to the king, Ahab at the time, and he says, you've forsaken your God. You let all these other foreign idol worshippers into your house, because he was married to a lady named Jezebel, and she was a Gentile. And this is where Elijah says to the king, get all your prophets, get 450 prophets of Baal and your 600 prophets of Ashtoreth and 1,000 prophets, and bring them here. And they build this altar, and then Elijah builds his altar, and he says, we're going to have this showdown. You build your altar, you call fire down from heaven, and if your God sends fire down from heaven, then he's the God. And I'm going to build an altar and call fire down from heaven, and if my God consumes the altar, then my God is the God. And there's this massive showdown. This is a story most of you are probably familiar with. So they go through this whole process, and the Gentile gods, the ones worshiping Baal and Ashtoreth, they're all on the mountain trying to get their God to respond. They've prepared the offering, and they're singing and they're dancing and they're calling out to their God, and they're cutting their own flesh, and they're doing all these things to try to worship their God so that he would respond to them, and nothing happens. And Elijah's just there mocking them. Then this is what Elijah turns and does. He says, at the time of the offering of the evening sacrifice, Elijah the prophet came near and said, O Lord, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known this day that you are the God in Israel, that I am your servant, and I have done all these things at your word. Remember, over and over again, Jesus in John's gospel has been saying that he only does things in accord with the Father, that he only speaks in accord with the Father. Elijah over and over says, I only speak what God tells me to speak. In John chapter 5, Jesus says the Son can do nothing on his own accord, but only what he sees the Father doing. Whatever the Father does, the Son likewise. And then in John 8, when you have lifted up the Son of Man, you will know that I am he, that I do nothing of my own authority, but I speak just as the Father taught me. All referencing back to Elijah, which is now coming to its culmination here. Follow me. I know this feels like a bit of a tangent. It's like we're back in 1 Kings. Why are we reading all these stories from Elijah? Because this is a strange prayer that Jesus prays. It's the first time in the whole gospel that we see him look up to heaven and pray, speak to the Father directly. And the words are strange. So the question is, why? Why is he praying this prayer, and why is he using the words that he's using? Here's the rest of what happens that you are probably familiar with in the story of Elijah and the prophets of Baal. Here's the rest of that text. Elijah says this, answer me, O Lord. Answer me, that this people may know that you, O Lord, are God, and that you have turned their hearts back. Then the fire of the Lord fell and consumed the burnt offering and the wood and the stones and the dust, and licked up the water that was in the trench. Remember, they built a trench around the altar and filled it with water. And when all the people saw it, they fell on their faces and said, Lord, he is God, the Lord, he is God. Again, this is the response that the Jews and the crowd and everybody should have had when Lazarus comes out of the grave. Jesus is trying to get the people to understand, when you see this miracle happen right in front of you, you have to respond the same way that those people responded. When they saw the miracle that Elijah did, they fell down on their face and they said, this is the God. That's the response the people should have had to Jesus when he calls to Lazarus, come out of the grave, and he actually walks out. But it's not the response that they had. So here's the continuation of the sign in John chapter 11. When he said these things, he cried out with a loud voice, Lazarus, come out. And the man who had died came out, his hands and feet bound with linen strips, and his face wrapped with a cloth. Jesus said to them, unbind him and let him go. All the stories about how long Lazarus had been in the tomb, and his face being bound and his feet being bound, and his hands and feet. All signs to show the people reading this story and the people who witnessed it that this man was actually dead. The people who buried him wrapped him up because they believed he was dead. He was put in the tomb for 4 days. That's well past the time frame that Jews would have considered someone actually dead. There's no question here, based on the details, that these people believed this man was dead. So that you might know that he was dead, buried properly. Maybe you're still wondering a little bit, why is it only important that Jesus would take the place of the prophet Elisha so that the people might respond in the same way? I don't think so. Here's the sign that Jesus is trying to perform, that he's been setting up. The death and resurrection of Lazarus. That would point us to the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. But the curious thing about Elisha is that Elisha was taken up into heaven in a whirlwind. He didn't experience death in his life. So this is another story from Elijah, 2 Kings this time, 2 Kings chapter 2. This is the last one we'll look at. Here's how the story goes. God says to Elisha, "Go and find Elisha and anoint him as the prophet after you." And he gives him some other kings to anoint as the next king and that sort of thing too. But he goes to Elisha, anoints him as king, and then Elisha starts following Elijah around all over the place. I'm going to go with you, I'm going to go with you, I'm going to go with you. They walk up to the Jordan, and Elijah parts the Jordan, and they walk through on dry ground. And then when they get to the other side, Elijah says, "What is it that you want from God?" And Elijah says, "I want a double portion of whatever you have." So I don't know what you have, but whatever it is that God has given you, the anointing, I want a double portion of that. And Elijah says to him, "If you see me taken up into heaven, then basically what you ask has been granted to you." And so this is how that story goes. Then 3 verses later, as they still went on and talked, behold, chariots of fire and horses of fire separated the two of them, Elijah and Elisha. And Elijah went up by a whirlwind into heaven. And Elisha saw it, and he cried, my father, the chariots of Israel and its horsemen. And he saw him no more. So put the pieces together of the sign. We've been saying this is not just a miracle. This is not just Jesus raising somebody from the dead. Oh, a miracle, super cool. This is a sign of what we're supposed to believe about who Jesus is. So put the pieces together. He's raising Lazarus from the dead. I said weeks and weeks ago, Lazarus has to die in order to be the perfect sign of who Jesus is. In order to be the final climactic sign of what Jesus is going to do, he has to die, and then he has to resurrect from the dead. Because Jesus is the suffering servant. He's the one who will die, then resurrect. That's significant for us because what I talked about last week, what you and I don't need is to be saved from death forever. What you and I need is to be resurrected spiritually first and then physically second. But then put that sign of the death and resurrection of Lazarus together with Jesus' prayer in the form and the likeness of Elijah. In Jesus' case, there's not going to be a prophet who comes after him and resurrects him from the dead. He's going to resurrect himself from the dead. But after he resurrects himself from the dead, he's going to be taken up into heaven, and he's not going to die. This prayer is not just for funsies. He doesn't just look up to God and say, I'm about to do this cool thing. Thanks for hearing me. Notice what he says. On account of the people standing around, that they might believe that you sent me. The same way that they believed God when Elijah did stuff in the past, and people fell down on their face and said, this is the God. He wants them to have that same response. And then no doubt when he dies and resurrects and ascends to heaven, he's hoping that they have that same response. If this guy was taken up into heaven and he died and resurrected from the dead by his own accord, then what we should be doing is falling down on our face saying, Lord God, this is the one. Got to put all these pieces of the sign together, because if you miss it, you won't understand that the plan of Jesus was always the death, resurrection, ascension. Was always the plan. In fact, it's been the plan this whole time that God's been orchestrating this in this life. Think about it like this. Most of the time we read this story and we think to ourselves, wow, God orchestrated the details of all of this really perfectly. I mean, he was about to be stoned to death in Jerusalem. He went to the other side of the Jordan. Lazarus gets sick. He waits 2 days. He orchestrates this great, awesome, wonderful sign. But if in the background of his prayer is the words of Elijah and the story of Elijah, then what's actually happening is God has been setting up this final climactic sign since the time of Elijah, which means thousands of years before Lazarus was born, or Mary, or Martha, or Jesus, or any of all that. There was a guy named Elijah whom God anointed, had all these things happen to in his life, to which you can read in the story at some points, Elijah's like, why is this stuff happening? Why is this woman's son dying? Like, why am I here? Having no idea that thousands of years later, he would literally be a part of the sign of the Messiah, of the Christ, the Son of God. We don't think on that scale. But you can't miss it. If you miss it, then you won't get the sign of what he's trying to put together. It's crazy to think that God has not just been orchestrating this sign, even just in his own day. He's been orchestrating this sign long before he was on earth, long before he was God incarnate. From heaven, orchestrating these things so that thousands of years later, we don't miss the sign. It's fascinating. It's crazy to think that all these pieces are connected. So connect with the text. Our journey of faith looks somewhat similar. Starts with death. Starts with not physically dying, because once you're physically dead, your faith journey is over. You will be judged according to what you believe. But it's the knowledge of understanding that we're dead already, spiritually, today. This same story that signified by Lazarus dying is the same for us. Starts when we understand that we're dead. Not just struggling, not just trying to figure out if we can follow God, but dead. There was a guy in church history named Luther who came to this conclusion that he was dead in his trespasses and sins. 1500s, Catholic priest. And in the system of the day, they were taught that the only way to get to heaven, he was teaching, he wasn't just taught because he was a Catholic priest. The only way to get to heaven is you have to confess everything. You are going to be sinful, but the only way to go straight to heaven is to confess everything and get absolved for it. So this is part of the reason why there is confession in that faith system. You go to confession so that you can receive absolution from a priest, and then if you can confess everything and live as righteously as possible, you could potentially skip purgatory, go straight to heaven. This was his goal. This is what he wanted to do. And so he would spend hours and days, multiple days in a row, going into the confession booth, confessing everything he could possibly think of to confess he's ever done wrong in his life, with the goal of, I'm going to get straight to heaven. I'm not going to do this purgatory thing. I don't want to wait to go to heaven. I want to go to heaven as quickly as possible. And the story goes something like this, by his own testimony recorded, that he goes into the confessional one day, spends hours in there confessing what he thinks is everything wrong with his life, gets absolution from the priest, walks out, gets 10 steps away, and then remembers something that he didn't confess. To which Luther came to the conclusion, I can never be good enough. Like, it doesn't matter how many hours I spend in here. It doesn't matter how much time I spend thinking about my sins and my past and how honest I am and how much I confess. I can't remember them all. I don't have time in my life to confess them all. And he was just struck with this sense of hopelessness of, there's no way I could possibly be good enough to get to heaven. And so instead of turning away from God, he turned back to the Scriptures. And he found Paul's letter to the Galatian church that said, it's by grace you've been saved through faith, not by your works, so that no one can boast. And he came to the conclusion that it's not about how many times you go in and confess. It's not about how many sins you can remember. It's not about how good of a life you live. It is simply about the grace of God by believing that you receive salvation. And that truth shifted the church completely to an understanding that we don't work for our salvation, and we can't possibly remember every sin that we've committed or confess it. We just simply have to have faith. It first comes by a recognition that we're dead. There's no possible way we could be good enough, no matter how hard we try. Then there's a moment where you have to be called, just like Lazarus, called out of the tomb, where Jesus steps up and says, I want you, come to me. And some people in the theological world might call that regeneration. You believe. For us, it's not just a dead guy just getting up out of the tomb and saying, hey, what's going on? In the spiritual walk of deadness, it's belief. It's understanding who Jesus Christ is and saying, I believe. The same thing that Jesus described to Nicodemus as being born again. And then it's getting up and following the command. Come waddling out of the tomb, or waddling out of the jail cell, whatever analogy you want to use. You take off the chains, you take off the bindings. It's about living free. No longer bound to sin, no longer bound to death. If salvation is waking up from death to life, if that's what salvation is in the story, Jesus does it first, dies, resurrects from the dead. We believe, we die to our sin and death, and resurrect from the dead to life. That's salvation. Discipleship is the second half. It's the last verse of our passage, when Jesus says, unbind him and let him go. That's discipleship. It's not more rules. It's not more weight. It's not pray more, go to church more, or follow the rules more. It's not burdening people. It's unbind and go free because you're in Christ. It's discipleship, the process of being unbound, not being more bound. The mission of Jesus was always death, resurrection, ascension. Death and resurrection, just like Lazarus. Ascension, just like Elijah. Our journey is the same. Death, not physical, but spiritual. Death to sin. Death to death, the punishment from sin. Belief, being born again or resurrected in the likeness of Christ, and then being unbound, set free, to live, to enjoy life, to rest, to have peace, to realize who you are and what God's called you for. And then upon our physical death, the truth that Jesus gives Martha becomes reality. He says, I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though he dies, yet shall he live. And everyone who lives and believes in me shall never die. Upon our death, after our belief, that's the reality that becomes the truth for us. Pray with me. God, what an orchestrated sign that you've put together so that all who read it and hear it would see you for who you are, would fall down at your feet and say, this is the God. This is the one, the only creator of the universe. So God, as I pray, as we walk away from this text, that if our eyes are not opened already, you would open our eyes. And if our eyes are opened, you would never let them be shut to these truths. That in moments of wavering or wandering or people coming and questioning, what is it that you really believe, that we would go back and say, even if I don't understand everything, what if just the sign of raising Lazarus from the dead was true? What if you were orchestrating, telling us exactly who you are for thousands of years, and then you accomplished it, and then you preserved it so that people thousands of years later could read it and put all the pieces together. And if that's the case, there's no other being, there's nothing else worth worshiping than some God who could orchestrate all those things. So God, I pray you'd open our eyes to be blown away by the text, by the orchestration of the lengths that you went to show us who Jesus really is, so that we would believe, so that when we die, we would live eternal, not just death and then judgment. God, I pray you would continue to make this true to us every day. I pray that the people who are close to death, this would be true too. That even in death, we live. And that those who think they have a bunch more time but don't have a bunch more time, you would make these truths reality to them soon, while there's still time left. And that those who are seeing the sign this morning, God, would say, I believe, I have to. I mean, it all makes sense, and there's no other way to believe. And that when they come to that conclusion, and they would confess to you, I believe, and I need you, and I'll trust you, and I won't trust anything else. And when they do, God, that you would be faithful to save and restore and resurrect. God, thanks for your word. It is so beautifully orchestrated and put together. Thanks for who you are. Thanks for being our Savior. Thanks for this sign showing us who Jesus is. We pray all this in his name. Amen.